Snow was a living thing that night, alive and angry, grinding itself against the windows, as if trying to get inside. The porch light hung in the storm like a weak candle, its halo devoured inch by the white. Emma pressed her forehead to the frozen glass until her breath painted a small, round fog. Through that small portal, she saw it, the shape. It was too big to be a branch, too still to be a bush. The snow refused to bury it completely, as if it respected the boundary of a human body. For a moment, she only stared. Then she saw the rise and fall. Fin, the shallow pulse of breath. Her heart stumbled once and steadied. It was someone out there, not something. She could have screamed, or run, or called for her grandmother, but Rose was next door, fixing the old furnace again, and the phone sat heavy on the hallway table, miles away in her mind. What mattered was that the figure was moving, barely, and the snow was not slowing down. She unlatched the door. The wind slammed it open in protest, hurling ice against her cheeks. The cold bit her like metal, sharp and shocking. It smelled like pennies and smoke. Chimes screamed against each other above her head as she stepped out, small boots crunching into the drift. The air tore the breath right out of her lungs. The shape was 20 feet from the porch. A motorcycle lay on its side near the fence, half swallowed by snow, its chrome, dull and breathing, steam like an animal in pain. Beside it sprawled a man in black leather. His jacket bore the image of a skull with spread wings, the white bones glinting through the flurry. His helmet was cracked, a spider web of white lines crawling across the dark shell. Emma hesitated. Her fingers clutched the porch railing, small and shaking. She could be afraid now, she thought. The man looked like danger, the kind of person adults warned about in grocery store whispers. But then she saw the blood crusted on his forehead, dark against the skin, and she decided, between the symbol and the wound, she chose the wound. She pulled her hood tighter and stepped into the storm. Each step sank almost to her knees. The wind slapped her back. The cold tried to turn her away, but she kept moving. The man's body was heavy in the snow, the cold already stiffening him. His head tilted toward her, lips parted, but no sound came. His breath was shallow, the color gone from his mouth. "Hey," she said, but the storm swallowed her voice. She knelt beside him anyway, the snow burning through her jeans. She touched his arm. The leather was slick and cold, but under it, faintly, there was heat. He was still alive. She needed to get him inside. The idea of calling for help flickered again, but she could see the way the storm pushed at the porch. By the time anyone arrived, the man would be another mound in the yard. She thought about the shovel by the door. She ran back to the porch, half tripping through her own footprints, and grabbed it from the rack. The plastic blade was cracked near the corner, patched with duct tape. It would do. She dragged it back through the snow and knelt again. The shovel wasn't a tool for power. It was for leverage. Her teacher had said that last month, showing pictures of ancient machines. She put the edge beneath his shoulder, planted her boots, toes turned out, knees steady, like she'd seen Rose do when she carried firewood, and pushed. The man moved an inch. The sound of snow scraping leather was like tearing fabric. She gritted her teeth and pushed again, rocking the shovel like a lever, shifting his weight toward her one slow inch at a time. The wind howled its disapproval, but the body slid. "Ready," she whispered, because that was what her grandmother always said before lifting something heavy. "We're going now." Her arms ached. The shovel handle bit her palms, even through her mittens. Still, she worked, 1 inch after another, until the porch steps loomed like cliffs. The snow was thinner there, slicker. She tipped the shovel sideways and used it as a ramp, bracing his shoulder with her knee as she rolled him, awkward and clumsy, up the steps. Her breath came out in clouds that hung between them. When she finally got him to the door, She was panting so hard she thought her chest might break. The door had drifted half shut. She shoved it open with her hip, dragging him through the frame, his boots scraping wood. The warm air rushed out to meet them, washing the cold from her face in one sweep. The smell changed, from ice and exhaust to cinnamon, old wood, and wool. Inside, the man looked impossibly large against the smallness of the room. The rug bunched beneath him, a dark, wet stain blooming where the snow melted off his jacket. His chest rose once, shallow and uncertain. His skin was grayish, lips cracked, the kind of pale that didn't belong in the living. Emma dropped the shovel, peeled off her wet mittens, and ran to the hall closet. She grabbed the thickest blanket she could find, grandmother's heavy quilt stitched from old coats, and the smaller blue one from the couch, the one with the satin edge she liked to rub when she couldn't sleep. She fetched the hot water bottle from the cupboard and the kettle from the stove, steam whispering at the spout. When she came back, the wind tried to follow, pushing the door open a few inches, but she slammed it closed with her shoulder until the latch caught. The house sighed, adjusting back to its rhythm. The storm could stay outside. She knelt beside him again, the floor damp beneath her knees. She spread one blanket under him to protect from the cold, seeping through the boards, and the other over him, tucking it beneath his chin. She filled the hot water bottle halfway, feeling the rubber stretch, soft and warm, then slid it under his jacket against his chest. The smell of wet leather and engine oil rose, mixing with the sweetness of her grandmother's soap. His helmet buckle was frozen. She worked it with her mitten until it bit her knuckle. Then she stripped the mitten off and tried again barehanded. Her fingers stung instantly, the skin reddening. She hissed through her teeth, but kept going. When the latch finally clicked, she eased the helmet off carefully, like she was unwrapping something fragile. His hair was damp, pressed flat in a ring around his head. There was blood near his temple, a thin crescent dried brown. She wiped it gently with a warm towel from the radiator until the skin showed pink again. The man didn't wake, but he sighed, a rough, broken sound that meant something inside him was still fighting. She looked at his face, trying to decide if he was dangerous. There were lines around his eyes that didn't look mean, just tired. His hands were rough, nicked and scarred, with a pale ring of skin on one finger, where a ring had once been. That detail stuck with her. Someone used to love him. She sat back and opened her toy doctor bag. The little plastic stethoscope gleamed red and blue under the lamp. She pressed it to his chest. Not because she thought it would work, but because doing something made her less scared. The fake diaphragm was cold, but she imagined it hearing his heart anyway. She counted softly, 1, 2, 3, until the rhythm of her voice matched the rhythm of his breathing. She glanced toward the window. Snow slapped the glass. A pale blur. Somewhere under the storm's hiss, she heard the creak of the porch roof, the groan of wood under weight. She thought again of calling for help. The phone was only 10 steps away. She stood, legs trembling from cold and effort, and walked to it. The dial tone buzzed softly when she lifted the receiver. Her finger hovered over the holes. She looked back through the open doorway at the man lying on the floor, half swallowed by blankets, breath faint. But there, the thought of him alone, even for a moment, while she talked to someone who couldn't arrive for another hour, it felt wrong. He didn't need voices far away. He needed someone here to keep the warmth close. She set the receiver down and went back to him. The clock ticked once, twice. She pulled the blanket tighter around him and then, shivering, around herself too. She leaned against the door, her shoulder pressed to the wood as if she could keep the storm from taking him back. The smell of leather filled her nose again. Dark, metallic, not unpleasant anymore. It reminded her of her neighbor's garage in summer, of engines, humming and hands fixing what was broken. His breathing steadied. Just a little. She smiled. Small and tired. Hi, she whispered again, voice cracking but sure. I'm Emma. You're inside now. It's warmer here. The corner of his mouth twitched. Almost a word. Almost nothing. She took that as answer enough. Outside, the storm clawed at the eaves. Inside, the air settled, warm and alive. Emma folded her knees to her chest, wrapped her arms tight around them, and listened to the breathing beside her. The world could howl all it wanted. She wasn't letting him freeze. Not tonight. The house had a way of holding quiet, the way a good hand holds a bird, firm enough to keep it from flying off, gentle enough not to crush it. In that held quiet, Emma listened to the big man breathe. She counted without numbers, timing herself to his chest, a patient measure that soothed her, the way seashells soothe the ear with ghost ocean. The hot water bottle gave a soft rubber sigh each time his ribs moved and settled. Heat drifted from the old radiators in waves as thin as veil fabric. The floor had warmed under the place where she knelt. A key turned in the back door, a small domestic click that belonged to their house the way the clock belonged. Snow dusted off a coat in the mudroom. Boots found the mat by memory. And then Rose was there in the entry, winter on her shoulders, cheeks bright from the walk, gray hair freckled with melting pearls. Rose took everything in with the practiced sweep of a nurse and a mother, and a woman who had spent a life fixing what could be fixed. She did not gasp. She did not say, "Oh my." Her eyes did the math on the quilts and the wet floor, and the cracked helmet on Emma's red hands, and the rubber bottle tucked high under torn leather. And then her face settled into work. "Hello there," she said to the man who could not answer. To Emma, she said, "Good job." And the two words put a straightness in the girl's back. As sure as a new willow stake braces a young tree. He was cold, Emma said, already feeling foolish for the obviousness of it. "Is he breathing?" Rose asked. Emma showed her the rise and fall, small but regular, and Rose knelt, the house's warmth folded closer, attentive now, like a dog laying its head on the lap of someone hurt. Rose's fingers found a pulse at the side of his neck. She watched his chest long enough for patience to feel like action. She slid the outer edge of her hand under his sleeve without lifting his arm, careful as if lifting a sleeping child, and read the temperature of skin. Worry wrote itself quiet across her mouth, and did not disturb the rest of her face. "Warm first," she said. "You did that. Now we protect the head and the leg." Emma showed the small crescent of blood at his hairline. "I warmed it," she said. "I did not scrub." "Good," Rose said, and then she leaned close to the cracked helmet without moving it, tracing the starburst with a knuckle, thinking in the old language of impacts and angles and grace. She did not flinch at the skull and wings stitched on the back of his jacket. Symbols were loud. Bodies spoke the truer dialect. Something inside the jacket blinked, a weak green that was more insistence than light. Rose saw it with the corner of her eye, and turned her attention the way a bird cocks its head. Her fingers went to the inside seam and slid into a pocket built for secrecy and emergencies. She drew out a small black rectangle, with a face like a stubborn beetle, and a pulse that said, "Still here, still here." "What is it?" Emma asked. "A beacon," said Rose. "It tells people where you are." The light stuttered again, thinner now, as if it were running on borrowed breath. Rose looked at the man, at the door, at the storm pressing its cold shoulder against their old wood. She pressed the rubbered button and the light went out. The silence after it went dark was not an absence but a presence. The air in the little entry seemed to thicken by a degree, as if the house had closed its own hands around them. "If there is a search already," she said in a voice meant for the room and the walls and the listening wood, "they have enough to find the house. He is inside. We keep him that way." Emma did not know the geography Rose was measuring. only that something had been decided in a language of grown hearts. She pulled the quilt closer around the man's arm in small dimples, the way she tucked edges around herself on nights when the wind fussed at the eaves. Rose cut a look down the long line of denim under leather and put 3 fingers gently above the knee. "Not here," she murmured, and then at the ankle, "Here." The leg spoke under her hands in heat and swelling. "We do not straighten," she said. "We keep it from moving. Fetch my long gray scarf from the rocker and the stack of dish towels from the stove." Emma went and was back before the kettle could build any hurry. Together they slid folded towels under the crooked places without lifting anything they did not have to lift. Together they wrapped the scarf in a warm band and tied the knot where fabric would not press bone. When they tucked the ends, the man groaned through his teeth in a voice he did not choose. His eyelids opened and closed like old shutters, then opened again enough to let the room in. Emma felt the change like a lamp being turned up. She leaned forward instinctively, her small shadow falling across the hard planes of his face. "Easy," she said. "You fell. We fixed the warm part." He tried to shape a word, and the word rubbed his throat raw on the way out. He coughed and winced, and then blinked as if the light itself were something to be solved. "Here," Rose said, and she was suddenly there again with a spoon and a small spill of steam. She set the back of the spoon to his lower lip, let the cocoa kiss his mouth, and watched the swallow. It went where swallowing should go. "We go slow," she said. "There is time." "Where am I?" he said, the question sounding like stones sliding under water. "In my entry," said Rose. "I am Rose. This is Emma." He turned toward the smaller name, because the heat of the room seemed to gather there, because the quiet there felt like a promise. "You," he said, and surprise softened the gravel. "I pulled you with the shovel," Emma said. "You were heavy." The corner of his mouth tried on a laugh without noise. Then he looked for something with his hands, not looking with his eyes so much as remembering what the body remembers when it is trying to gather itself. His fingers made a small reaching under the quilt toward the inside of the jacket. Emma saw the decision happening behind his face and went under the quilt with her own hand, the way you reach under a sleeping cat to shift a pillow. Her fingers found seams, and then the familiar rectangle. She coaxed the wallet out and placed it on top of the blanket where he could see what she was doing. "I did not take anything," she said. "You looked like you wanted this." "Thank you," he managed, and the weight of those 2 words told her how much they had cost him. The wallet was worn soft at the corners, the leather remembering every hand that had held it, the way a path remembers every foot that has passed. When he opened it, the largeness of his hands turned delicate. A small photograph lived behind clouded plastic. Its corners rounded the way things get rounded by being carried against the heart. A girl with pigtails grinned from the tiny frame, mouth gap wide, eyes bright with ordinary joy. Emma leaned, because children lean toward pictures of other children, the way flowers lean toward light. He turned the wallet without being asked, aware of a ceremony taking place that did not need words. "She is pretty," Emma said. "What is her name?" His voice sanded itself down past the roughness to make a name fit through. "Sarah," he said. Emma nodded as if the name had been waiting on the table next to the cocoa tin all morning. It suited the room. It sat down and folded its hands without fuss. "She is not here," he said, and the sentence was clean, and the wound beneath it was not. He did not say the rest, because the rest was a cathedral, and his breath was too small to pray inside it yet. "I will remember her," said Emma, as simply as she might have said, "I will put your cup here or I will close the door." She meant it. The house felt it. Rose heard the name and the promise both, and did not comment with any arrangement of words. She poured a little more cocoa into the enamel mug instead, a small, silent blessing that said, "This child belongs in our kitchen, and the memory she carries can sit at our table without knocking anything over." He looked at the skull and wings on his own jacket, at the fraying thread on the rocker patches, at the hot water bottle beating a ridiculous steady comfort beneath the same leather that had seen long roads. "I am not someone you should help," he said, "because old rules like to be recited even when they are wrong." Emma weighed that with the solemn patience of someone who has already made the harder choice. She looked at the emblem in the dried half-moon of blood, looked at her own mitten where she had thrown it on the floor to reach a stubborn buckle, and she touched the place on his temple with 2 fingers, light as breath. "You were hurt," she said. "Hurt people need help." Rose did not smile, but something unknotted behind her eyes. "Drink if you can," she told him. "Your body will do most of the rest if we let it." He reached for the mug and his hand learned again how to move through a world where things were not trying to kill him. It shook anyway. Emma took the far side of the mug without ceremony. Together, careful as if carrying light itself, they brought sweetness to his mouth. "What is your name?" Rose asked, because names are doors, and she preferred them open. "Marcus," he said after 2 tries, and it was different. Spoken plain like that, in a small entry with quilt lint in the air, less like a banner and more like a person. "Marcus," said Rose, fitting the name into the room, checking for sharp edges. "You will stay until your friends find you, or until you can walk enough to meet them. Your leg says do not show off. Your head took a knock that might argue later. You will not argue now." "Not arguing," he said, and a ghost smile crossed the place, where old damage had learned how to be soft again. Emma touched the cloudy plastic of the wallet. "You can show me more pictures when you are less sleepy," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her for a long breath, and somewhere inside a set of gears that had been locked by grief clicked into a different tooth. He did not know the name of that sound yet. He would know it later. For now, he only said okay. The kettle settled on the back of the stove with a little sigh of metal losing tension. The window ticked once. The storm testing, and then moving on to gnaw at some other edge of the world. The heat filled the gaps the cold had left. Emma smoothed one wrinkle from the quilt that did not need smoothing, because useful hands need work. "When you sleep, we will be here," Emma said. "I will not let the cold in." He believed her. He did not know why belief chose her voice, and not the other voices in his life, but it did. The way water finds a path it likes and wears it into a river. His eyes closed because they were heavy, and this time they closed like a choice, and not a collapse. For a while, no one moved. The house kept the room the way you keep a promise. The skull and wings on his back became thread, and stitching under a granddaughter's lamp, Rose went to the kitchen to call next door and then the diner. The cord cradled in her shoulder, the words steady and exact and none of them extra. Emma tucked the wallet into the curve of the quilt, right by his ribs, as if she were marking a page they would return to together. In garages and kitchens far away, voices leaned into radios and wrote down routes on napkins with greasy fingers. In a little entry in a quiet town, a child and a grandmother guarded a man who had been a shape in the snow. None of them knew the road that was already turning toward their street. They only knew the next right thing and did it. And the house held them while they did. The storm did not leave so much as loosen its grip. By morning, the sound outside had turned soft and thick, a padded hush that made every other sound inside the house feel chosen. Pale winter light pressed through the lace curtains in a wide stripe across the entry rug. Emma woke curled where the door met the wall, the blanket around her shoulders and the wood warm against her back from the heat inside. She did not speak. She did her checks instead, the way she had taught herself, hand under quilt for warmth along the big forearm, eyes to his chest for rise and fall, ear bent to catch breath, warm, rising, breathing. The knot behind her ribs relaxed. From the kitchen came the whisper of a kettle beginning to think about boiling, and the soft scrap of a knife on toast. Cocoa rode the air in a warm brown ribbon. Emma slid the hot water bottle from beneath the jacket where Rose had tucked it, surprised again at how right and strange it looked there, like a toy heart beneath armor. It had gone slack. She brought it to the kitchen, where the stove made little metal pings as it stretched into the day. Rose took the bottle without asking, bled the air, filled it until it sagged heavy in the hands, and passed it back. He will wake when his body is ready, Rose said, sleeve pushed up, every movement precise. You can be the first thing he sees again. Emma liked that. She patted back and eased the bottle into its warm pocket. She smoothed the quilt, as if closing a page she meant to return to without a crease. Outside, the street had been combed by plows. Tall edges of snow squared and stacked, and the air had that bright, glassy look winter has when it pretends to be kind. The sound reached her before the sight. Low, layered, steady. Not the long complaint of a freight train in the valley, and not a single truck on the county road. Many throats speaking in agreement. She went to the window and stood on her toes to see over the rim of the sill. At the end of the block, 6 motorcycles turned the corner and came up the street in a careful line. Dark shapes moving like geese do when they decide to fly in a different letter. Headlights dim in the daylight, tires biting the clean plow line. They parked along the curb as if they had measured it yesterday and checked the math twice this morning. Engines cut together, leaving the air ringing. Steam lifted from chrome, leather creaked. The men did not hurry. The first rider took off his helmet and tucked it under his arm. His face had lines from sun and wind rather than from scowling. He glanced back, and the second rider unwound his own helmet and shook out hair. He wore a beard that would have fit the name Bear, even if Emma had not already decided it. She opened the door before anyone could knock. Cold pressed its face into the room and then paused, held back by the smell of coffee and old wood and leather warming. Emma stepped out and remembered her socks, hopped back in and shoved her feet into her boots without bothering with laces. "Hi," she said, level, as if they were late guests to a good breakfast. "He is inside." The lead rider blinked once at the small girl assigning him instruction. Then he nodded, as if she were a captain, and he had been waiting for orders. "Steele," he said toward the house in a tone that meant, "We found you." "Brother," he looked back. "I am Tommy. I am Emma," she said. "He fell in the yard. I used the shovel." The bearded man smiled with the corner of his mouth. "The way a heavy door cracks when a lock turns true." "That tracks," he said softly. Boots found the mat. Gloves slid into back pockets, the way men put hands behind their backs in churches. They did not rush through the threshold. Emma stood aside and shut the door quick against the cold. The house kept its warmth exactly where it had kept it a moment before, as if the weather obeyed Rose. They did not crowd the quilts. They let the room tell them where to be. The skulls on their jackets stared at the floorboard. Bear dropped to a crouch near the end of the blanket and linked his fingers loosely where everyone could see them. Emma recognized the way he made himself small for a frightened animal to sniff his knuckles. She had seen Mr. Jenkins do that with the neighbor's dog when it had a splinter once. "You pulled him," Bear said to Emma, and for a voice that size, it was surprising how gentle it could be. "With the shovel," Emma said, and pointed with her chin at the old blue blade leaning against the wall. Duct tape silver against plastic. He was heavy. He helped a little. Tommy looked at Marcus and then at the cracked helmet on the mat and then at the scarf knotted clean around the bad leg. "We ran the roads all night," he said. "Your signal cut at the edge of town. We found the bike by the fence." A light blinked, Emma said without deciding to hide it. Rose turned it off. "He is inside now." For a breath, the room felt thick with a thing that had to be understood without pushing words around. Road rules and house rules met eyes. Tommy looked at Rose. Respect moved across his face and settled like a decision. "Inside is better," he said. "Inside is safe." From the kitchen, Rose came with a towel in her hands. A calm weather, moving through a smaller weather. She looked at the men the way she looked at a new tool before she decided where to keep it. "Gentlemen," she said, and made it true in that room. "Coffee, please." Tommy said, his voice dropping 2 steps to fit the ceiling. Before she set mugs down, Rose glanced at the low table by the quilts. There was a small crescent of oil from last night where leather had kissed wood. She wiped it with the heel of her hand and the faded towel until the shine went dull, then placed heavy mugs exactly where hands could find them without knocking anything over. It was a small thing, and Emma saw it. It meant these men were guests. It meant the room still belonged to them all. "We have cocoa, too," Rose said to the room, not looking at any one face longer than the others. She set a blue mug near the quilt, close enough for an easy reach. Then she put the towel over her arm like a quiet flag, and stepped aside. Marcus made a noise the body makes when it has to decide between sleep and the world. His eyes came open grudgingly. Emma leaned in so she could be the first shape he had to solve. The room followed after her. Jackets, patches, the set of shoulders he knew in his bone. "Steel," Tommy said, and in that one word, there was relief, and there was inventory, and there was the way men make lists without paper. Marcus tried to rise, and Payne argued fast. Rose did not raise her voice, and still made the rule. "Do not argue with your leg or your head," she said. "You will lose. Drink. Sleep again. Repeat." "Yes, Marcus said, and he did not try to make a joke of it. He put his hand out for the blue mug because Emma was holding it, and the two of them moved the cup together the way you carry a candle in a draft. Tommy crouched until he and Marcus were eyes even, and the room seemed to sit with them. "We nearly wore the road thin," he said. "Your thing blinked until it did not. We did not expect this. This was the blanket. This was the blue mug. This was a girl in boots without laces who said what she saw and did what she said." Bear reached inside his jacket and brought out a folded page with a smudge of grease in one corner and tight pencil writing that meant a person had cared enough to make it clear. He laid it on the table near the lamp where the light would catch it and tapped a line. 6:23, he said softly, and Emma read the neat words, "Albany base to all presidents." The numbers sat on the paper like little posts in snow. She held her hand above them without touching, the way you hold a palm over a candle when you are not done with its light. She liked that there was proof on a page. Proof in air disappears when air changes its mind. "We will be out of your way soon," Tommy said to Rose. "Not from fear, from manners. If he can be moved day after tomorrow, we will come back with a plank and enough shoulders. He is not furniture," Rose said, and it was not scold. It was an adjustment. "He will need shoulders." "Yes, and patience. We can pay for," Tommy began, and Rose lifted the towel a half-inch, and the idea fell quiet where it should. "Coffee first," she said. "Breath, then roads." Marcus worked his hand under the quilt until his fingers found the soft cornered wallet. He opened it, the big hands turning tender as if they wore a suit for a moment, and breathed at the small photo behind cloudy plastic. Tommy saw without staring. and closed his eyes for one count of his heart. A human acknowledgement that made more room for the picture without needing to see it. "We will not leave you alone," Tommy said. That was not a threat, and not a promise anyone needed to sign. It was a rule that lived inside them whether the world liked it or not. "We will bring what is needed and come back with what is better." He looked at Emma when he said better, as if the word had her shape now. Marcus let his head roll toward Emma. When Tommy said steel, he did not answer to that name yet. He found Emma with his eyes and touched the blue mug with his knuckles in a small yes. The old road name could wait. The house name fit. "Thank you," Bear said to Emma, not as a performance but as if saying grace. "Thank you for the work you did here." Emma thought of the shovel and the lever and the rubber sting in her fingers when the helmet buckle bit. "You are welcome," she said, because that is the right reply to thanks, and because it felt like a real trade. Tommy stood, and at the door he paused. He looked at the cracked helmet on the mat. Then he looked at the shovel that had become a plank, and a lever, and a bridge. He touched 2 fingers to the handle, the way some men touch altars, and said, "We respect the work you did here, Emma." He did not raise his voice. The words filled exactly the space they needed to fill, and then sat down. Helmets found crooks of elbows instead of heads until they were outside. Rose opened the door, and Cold tried one quick breath into the room and was told no. The men stepped out, careful not to scuff the edge of the rug, Boots finding the cleared path. When the door closed, the engines shook themselves awake, then fell into one steady animal sound, as they lined up again and slid away along the narrow street until they were smaller and then gone. Emma went back to the folded page and traced the air over the numbers again. Morning numbers. Beginnings. She tucked the paper a finger width under the lamp, so it would not flutter when the door next opened. She set the blue mug where Marcus could reach it when he woke again. She pressed her palm over the quilt where the hot water bottle rested, and held it there until she felt the heat admit her hand. "Inside is safe," she thought, and the house agreed. Marcus slept. Rose washed 2 extra mugs, and did not put them away. The pencil time did not move. Outside, the world arranged itself for whatever was coming next. Inside, the promise of it lived quietly on a table, in neat writing, and in a girl's small hand hovering over the proof like a guard. By late morning, the house moved with the quiet confidence of a place doing its job. Heat stitched the rooms together, the kettle sang and fell silent, the clock stepped forward without hurry. Marcus slept inside that cadence, the deep mending sleep that seems to pull a person back from the weather. Emma sat cross-legged on the rug at his side, one palm resting over the warm rise of the hot water bottle beneath leather, as if her hand could convince the heat to stay. She watched the small proofs of improvement, the softening line at his mouth, the steadier tide of breath, the pink returning where the helmet had pressed too hard. Rose worked in measured loops between kitchen and entry, like a tide that had studied this shoreline for years. She checked the scarf binding at the bad leg with 2 fingers and a steady eye. She set toast to cool on the rack so it would not sweat. She wiped a faint crescent of oil from the low table with a towel faded by many washings, and did not complain that it existed. When she refilled the blue mug with cocoa, she did it as if topping a lamp. Outside, the street shone with new edges. Plow walls stood crisp and high. Sun laid a bright blade along each ridge of snow, and water tapped from icicles like a metronome too polite to command. A distant truck downshifted and then went quiet again. In that bright winter hush, sound carried true. Emma heard boots on porch boards before any knock, and she was at the door by the time the second foot found the mat. Tommy stood in the light, with his helmet tucked under his arm, steam lifting from his jacket in thin veils. Bear loomed behind him like a building you could trust to lean on. The other riders kept to the curb, hands in pockets, eyes soft, leaving the porch to the house. "May we?" Tommy asked, shaped like a guest and not a demand. "Come in," Emma said, swinging the door wide and stepping back so the warm could keep its ground. She watched them stop on the mat as if there were a chalk line there. Only permission could cross. "How is he?" Tommy asked. "Sleeping," Emma said. "Warm. Breathing good." "Good," Bear murmured, and the single word carried a night of roads inside it. They set their helmets low, not high, a signal that said, "We understand where we are." Rose met them with heavy mugs and, before placing them, wiped a small smear from the table with the heel of her towel. A plain gesture that turned visitors into guests. The men saw it. Their shoulders eased one notch. "We have something to say," Tommy began, and then let his gaze rest on Marcus a beat, as if the room itself should be included. He turned to Rose, because road rules stop at a door. "Ma, we ran the county until our tanks thought about quitting. Your home did what our engines could not. It held him. Homes hold what is inside," Rose said. She made no ceremony of it. Tommy nodded. He looked at Emma. "And you did the work," he said, simply. "We do not forget that." Emma glanced at the old shovel leaning by the wall. Duct tape silver against blue. The patched blade catching a sliver of sun. Praise shaped like a vow had no easy answer. She held still and let the words stand. Bear sank to a crouch near the quilt, big hands folded where everyone could see them. He breathed in the quiet and put his voice into it so it would fit the room. "We are coming back," he said, and his beard hid the way his mouth tightened. "Not to take your kitchen, not to rattle your block. We are going to do right by what was done here." Tommy set his helmet on the floor and placed both palms on its crown like a man resting a hat on a pew. "Properly," he said. The word was not loud. It had weight. Emma watched that word change the air. It made the room feel taller. "Words are good," Rose said. "Plans are better. If your plan needs wind, take it outside, so this man can sleep." "We started at first light," Tommy said. "Calls out, more to place, people to mind. We will handle the road and the snow and the parts of the world that listen to us when we are our best selves in public. We would like to handle anything of yours you will let us. Our side is cocoa and quiet, and a leg that will not be hurried," Rose said, the smallest smile hiding behind her eyes. "You may handle the rest. Do it without swagger. Do it kindly." "Being our best selves in public," Bear repeated under his breath, testing the phrase like the first step on spring ice. A police cruiser rolled slow past the plow ridge. Tires whispered on salt. The engine settled to an idle at the corner and then moved on, the way neighbors do when they want to say "we saw" without making a scene. Tommy tracked the sound with his eyes and let it go. "We would prefer respect to surprise," he said. "We will speak with them. We will leave this street better than we found it." "That would be neighborly," Rose said. Tommy looked again at the shovel, at the taped corner bright in a slice of sun. He touched 2 fingers to the handle the way some men touch altars. "Work," he said, not to the tool but to the act. Then he turned his hand open to Emma for inspection. "Nothing hidden. We respect the work you did here." "Emma," she placed her small palm against his and felt the cold in the room lift a degree. "Thank you," she said, because the right reply still fit. Marcus stirred, as if the conversation had warmed a current within him. His lashes trembled. His mouth shaped the beginning of a word. Emma leaned, so she would be the first thing he had to solve. He opened his eyes. He found her first, then the room by degrees. "Steel," Tommy said without thinking, habit cutting its path through relief. Marcus tipped his knuckles lightly against the blue mug in Emma's hands, as if greeting a friend on a porch. He did not look toward patches and helmets. He looked at the cup, then at Rose. Yes, ma, am. He said to the rule she had not yet spoken. The old name could wait. The house name fit. Drink and rest. Rose said, and if you must talk, do not spend more than a few words at a time. Emma and Marcus moved the mug together, careful as if carrying a small flame. Steam softened the hard lines at his eyes. He swallowed, and the room let out a breath with him. Bear slid a folded page from his inner pocket and set it near the lamp where light could lay on it. We keep a log, he said quietly. We will add a line for this house. He did not point to any number. He did not need to. The neat strokes across the paper looked like a small road of proof. Emma held her palm over the page, not touching, guarding. The way you hover over a candle when you are not ready to blow it out. She liked that the promise sat in ink and not only in air. We will clear the walk once more before we go. Tommy said, we will set the bike straighter and cover it better. We will check back by afternoon. We will not bring noise to your door. Noise is not the enemy. Rose said, thoughtlessness is. Bring what you must. Bring it kindly. Yes, ma, am. Tommy said, and the yes had the shape of a promise a house could trust. He looked at the cracked helmet on the mat as if it were a bruise on a friend. He reached into his jacket and drew out a clean square of chamois, pale and soft. He set it on the helmet with a care that felt like mending. For when you clean this, he said to Marcus, so the first thing touching your head is not something that broke. He did not push the meaning. The cloth said it better than words. It acknowledged not only injury but the sting of failure, and replaced humiliation with gentleness. Marcus looked at the soft square and then down at his hands. He opened the worn wallet and slid the small photograph into his palm. He closed his eyes, not from pain, but from the relief of being allowed to be a person who could feel both loss and gratitude without being watched for weakness. The chamois had given him back a piece of quiet dignity he had not known he had misplaced. He kept the photo curved against his lifeline and let his hand rest on the quilt. On the porch, the cold nipped at noses and made breath visible. Helmets went on heads instead of hanging from elbows. Engines shouldered awake and then dropped into that steady animal hum that sounds like discipline more than threat. At the threshold, Tommy turned and spoke one more time without lifting his voice. We will thank her properly. He did not say the word again. The room already held it. The door closed and the house settled back into its seat. The engines slid away along the bright street and were folded by distance. A curtain across the way lifted a finger and fell. The kettle on the back burner ticked as it cooled. Emma picked up the chamois, rubbed the nap with her thumb, and felt the softness speak more clearly than speeches. She laid it back on the cracked helmet, like a bandage that knew it was helping heal more than plastic. She sat again and set her hand over the place where warmth hid, telling it to stay. What did they mean? She asked, not because she did not understand, but because saying it out loud would pin it to the board of the day. They meant they will put their bodies where their words are. Rose said, towel over her shoulder like a quiet flag. They meant they will carry the thanks themselves and not mail it. They meant they remember. Emma nodded. She looked at the log page and did not read the lines so much as she read the promise inside their neatness. She looked at the shovel and the taped corner and understood why Tommy had touched it. She let the pieces sit and warm in her chest, without forcing them into a picture. Marcus drifted and returned and drifted again, each time a little less far. When he woke enough to notice the helmet and the pale cloth, his face changed in a way that had nothing to do with pain. He angled the small photo in his palm so Emma could see it without ceremony. And then he set his hand back on the quilt. A man at rest who knows the next right thing is to accept care. By early afternoon, the sun climbed and taught the icicles to drip faster. Rose made a small list on the pad by the phone, in steady script, Soup towels warmed refill the bottle, and left the big things off, as she always did. Big things belong to hands, not paper. Emma slid the log page a finger width farther beneath the lamp, so it would not stir when the door opened again. She turned the blue mug so its handle would meet Marcus easily when he reached. She smoothed one wrinkle from the quilt that did not need smoothing, because useful hands like work, and when the quiet stretched thin, she whispered the sentence that had become a rule inside her. "When you sleep, we will be here. I will not let the cold in." The house answered in its own language of pipes and light. Outside, a phone far away would ring on a counter, and voices would travel through bright air like birds along a wire. Inside, a single word hung like a soft banner, where everyone could see it without strain. Properly, and the little room held it up. By afternoon, the light grew a narrow edge, the kind that makes hours feel counted even when no one says the numbers. The house held its own rhythm anyway. Heat moved through old pipes in soft breaths. The clock kept stepping forward with quiet certainty. Marcus slept and surfaced in small, even tides. Each time he woke, Emma was there with the blue mug turned just so, and her palm resting over the warm place under the leather. A gentle toll booth that asked nothing but presence. She had learned the vocabulary of the day, the kettle's early sigh, the faint tick of metal as Rose lifted a pot off the burner. Far away, the hush of a plow blade kissing asphalt. Beneath those familiar notes, a new sound threaded in and out, brief and crackling, like a bee behind glass deciding whether to live inside a jar. It came from the porch, paused, came again, patient as a messenger. Emma nudged the curtain with her knuckle. Tommy stood on the top step, helmet parked on the rail, a black handset tucked into his palm with a thin wire spiraling down into a box the size of a small loaf. He spoke into it with his head slightly bowed, as if courtesy belonged on airwaves too. He named places and promised behaviors the way a person recites a creed. Respect over surprise, he said. Keep it tight. No grandstanding. He listened, mouth shaping a quiet yes, without using his voice. 2 steps down, Bear kept a folded page on a clipboard and wrote in pencil that never wandered. Each line ended with a time spelled out, underlined once, the underlines looking like certainty rather than scorn. When he finished a note, he tapped the paper with a knuckle and tucked the pencil behind his ear. A small ritual that made ink feel like a kind of fuel. Emma let the curtain drop and turned back. Marcus lay awake, listening with his eyes. "They are making lists," she said, stating the most important truth she knew about solving any day. "Lists keep engines from becoming trouble," he said, slow enough that breath would not complain. He looked at her, and people. Rose arrived with soup that smelled like carrots and parsley and clean heat. She set the bowl on the low table on top of a folded towel, so the wood would not take on the bowl's burden. Her fingers checked the knot at the bad leg, the way you check a door you have already locked twice. "We will try the spoon," she said. "Just the broth. No showing off." "Yes, ma'am," Marcus answered, and Emma held the spoon like a coin she did not want to drop. Steam curled around his cheekbones. They found a rhythm together, sip and breathe and rest, and the lines near his eyes loosened as if someone had unthreaded them with care. Boots sounded on the porch again. The door did not knock. It leaned on politeness instead. Emma opened it and kept her body inside the warm. Tommy and Bear did not cross the threshold. They held the cold with their coats and stood like posts that knew their job. "We will be quick," Tommy said. "We brought proof, and then we will go make more of it." He passed Rose a clear sleeve with a zip at the top. Inside, pages faced each other like careful cards. The first wore the tight pencil strokes Emma had seen, lines marching in firm rows. The second was a printed map crossed by a thick, black route, a seam stitched across towns. Along that line someone had written small words in neat hand: fuel and shoulder and friendly and bridge ice. Little anchors meant to keep a large thing steady. The third page carried block letters and a blue stamp, a request for coordination, expected arrival windows, contact names. In the corner the date sat like a squared promise. We keep chain of custody clean when it matters, Bear said, almost shy about the tidy pride of it. Who held what, when, where, and for how long? He tapped the sleeve and then his chest. You can tell anyone who asks. No one here is asking, Rose said, but her mouth admitted she liked the order. Tommy's glance slid past her to the cracked helmet, the pale chamois laid across it like a calm hand. He took a slower breath that seemed to sit deeper in his ribs. Within the hour we will be at the clubhouse, he said. Radios. Phones. Hand to hand where it works better. People will reach in and we will reach back. Emma pictured a scarred table ringed with bodies, the kind of table that holds history. In knife marks and coffee stains, she pictured small photographs turned face up by large hands. She did not know why that image felt right, only that it did. What do you call the big person in your rooms? She asked. Names or handles? She wanted to carry the day properly. President, Bear said. Iron Mike. The name sounded like a tool that had been used, repaired, and then used again without self-pity. Emma nodded. May I? She asked. Looking at the sleeve, Rose opened the zip and let Emma lift the map. The paper felt smooth and smelled faintly of ink and cold. The thick black line across towns looked like a path a child might draw. When told to connect stars, Emma traced the air above the notes without touching. The way you hover a palm above a candle, you are not ready to extinguish. Each small word sat like a stake holding down a tent against wind. The route would become sound and chrome and faces. The notes insisted those would arrive with discipline. Properly, she said, first to herself and then to the room because the word asked to be heard. Tommy's mouth tipped. He let the word stand like a post. He held out his other hand, palm closed around a small circle. A coin, heavy and warmer than the air. Bear spoke while Emma read it with her fingers. A challenge coin, he said. Club on one side, a motto on the other. We do not hand them out like candy. This one lives in your desk drawer by the phone. When someone calls and doubts, you say the words along its edge, and they will understand which family is speaking. Emma held the coin to the light and read the teeth of letters around the rim. Family looks after family. The sentence made her chest do a new thing, an outward stretch like wings remembering how to open. She understood that this was not payment and not decoration. It was a promise shaped in metal that would not spoil if a day ran long. We cannot pay you, Tommy said, because paying would turn this into the wrong story, but you will not be left with a broken fence and a deadline while the world chooses its pace. Our answer to your work is our work. I have never liked money for the wrong stories, Rose said, and slid the sleeve onto the shelf beside the telephone, as if filing a recipe she meant to use. She set the coin in the little dish where spare buttons lived, placing it among things that fix other things. From the couch, Marcus listened. He let his eyes rest on the map. Then the coin, then the sleeve, then on Emma's steady hands. He did not reach. He closed his palm over the small photograph again, and kept it there, as if weighing grief and gratitude at once, and finding both legitimate. He did not apologize for either weight. The bee-jar crackle came from the porch again. Tommy lifted the handset without looking. Springfield confirms muster by late afternoon, he said. Soft in, softer out. Keep the kittens asleep. He smiled at Emma without changing his voice. Copy that. You will hear a lot tomorrow, he told her, setting the handset back in its cradle. It will begin far and arrive like weather. There will be rules. We will keep them. If you want an empty path from your porch to your gate, it will be there. If you want to stand on your step and wave, that too. Emma considered like a small mayor. I want kittens to sleep, and Mrs. Patterson not to be scared, and the icicles to stay where they are until spring. Bear's beard hid a grin. We can manage kittens and icicles, he said. Mrs. Patterson may take more than a day. Rose's eyes warmed. I will take Mrs. Patterson, she said. You take Bridges and ice? Done, Tommy answered. He shifted his weight, already thinking of rooms and phones and men with pencils. We will not keep your air. We have calls to make and chairs to fill. They stepped back, one and then another, bodies remembering precision even on a small porch. The door closed. Warmth settled where it had been. Emma carried the map to the low table and laid it beside the chamois and the blue mug. She looked at the thick line that would become rumble and chrome and faces, then at the little notes that would hold that river inside its banks. She liked that a plan lived on paper before it lived on asphalt. Paper could be held by a child and believed. Rose slid out the top page from the sleeve and set it beneath the lamp. The pencil strokes from the early morning looked like an army of patient ants. At the bottom, the time had been written in full words, not figures. The room seemed to draw a small breath on that gentleness. Emma put her hand above the words and closed her fingers softly in the air, as if she were cupping a flame from a draft. Nothing changed on the page. Something steadied inside her. Tell me your rules for tomorrow, she said to Marcus, because asking about a person's rules is a way to say, I see you. He tipped his head toward her, relief making honesty easy. Slow in, slower out. No revving at children. Hands visible around uniform. Road captains speak. Others listen. No patches across your doorstep, unless invited. I will invite anyone who brings cocoa and says please, Emma said. He let a small laugh happen. It altered his face in a way that made him look briefly like the picture might have looked if time had chosen a kinder path. The phone on the wall rang with the old bell sound that belonged only to their house. Rose lifted the receiver with her shoulder so both hands stayed free for notes. Yes, she said, and again, her voice turning a stranger into a neighbor in a single sentence. She listened, glanced at Emma, then at the dish where the coin shone, then at the sleeve by the phone. That will be fine, she said. We prefer respect to surprise. Bring what you must. Bring it kindly. She settled the handset back into its cradle. State police, she said. An officer will come by to speak about routes, not to arrest the rug for harboring a fugitive. To be neighborly. We are in the business of neighborly, Bear had said, and even though he was not in the room, the words seemed to sit on a chair and nod. Emma slid the map back into its sleeve, as if the paper could bruise, zipped it shut with a soft sigh, and turned the coin so the motto faced up. She touched the chamois once. A single stroke, like patting a sleeping dog. Outside, the sun glazed the broken crust of snow. Down the block, a boy tested a sled and whooped. The sound came thin and happy. Inside, Marcus drifted, anchored by the weight in his palm, steadied by cocoa and maps, and a promise shaped in metal. When he slept again, Emma sat with her hand hovering above the pencil time, keeping it like a candle, sheltered by small fingers. In the kitchen, Rose made another list fit for 2 people, and a small house bowls, extra mugs. Move the doormat. Tell Mrs. Patterson before anyone else does. Warm more towels. Emma murmured the sentence that had become law inside her. When you sleep, we will be here. I will not let the cold in. The pipes answered in their language. The clock stepped forward. Far rooms in far towns filled with voices saying new things into old air. The map lay still. The coin shone softly. The chamois rested where it belonged. And the word that had begun as a vow on a porch hung in the little room like a banner you could walk under without ducking. Properly, by late afternoon, the light thinned to a careful gray that made edges honest. Heat moved in slow breaths through the old pipes. The clock stepped forward without hurry. Marcus slept with one hand cupped over the small photograph, the blue mug within easy reach, the pale chamois resting on the cracked helmet, like a soft verdict. Emma sat cross-legged on the rug and watched the house breathe. The day felt like a bridge, plans behind them, a test in front of them. Tires whispered on salt outside, then stilled. A car door closed with polite firmness. She heard the soft percussion of boots on the porch and the tick of cooling metal. Rose wiped her hands on a towel that had been washed into gentleness and nodded toward the entry. "We asked for respect," she said. "Let us open the door first." Emma did. Cold leaned in, curious but held at the line. A state police officer stood on the boards with his hat in his hands instead of on his head. A second figure waited by the cruiser, present but not crowding. The cruiser idled low, the hum steady and without impatience. "Mrs. Richardson," the officer said, and made the title sound like something earned. "I am Captain Murphy. Thank you for taking my call. Come into the mat." Rose said, "Not past it yet. Let the house decide." He stepped onto the mat and stopped, steam lifting from his coat and vanishing in the warm air. He tapped a small square on his chest, and a quick chirp answered, a sound like a bird clearing its throat. "Body camera," he said. "It is on. If you request, I can mute audio in your home. I will keep the picture. The policy is the policy. Mute the sound," Rose said. "Let the picture do the work." He pressed the square, and the chirp answered again. Time glowed on the gray screen in neat digits, unread from where they stood. Emma liked that there would be a record of quiet that belonged to them. "We would like to be neighborly," he said, repeating the phrase the way a key repeats in a lock. "I have a packet for you." He held out a clear sleeve stamped in winter blue. Inside were 2 pages. The first was a route sketch with arrows drawn in a kind hand, nothing sharp. The second was a memorandum with names and phone numbers. Along the bottom ran small boxes for sign and time. Each box already carried a neat loop of pen and an hour written as words. Emma took the sleeve and felt the plastic hold the day like a jar holds preserves. Ink lines looked like roads seen through shallow water. She pointed at the line of boxes. "Who wrote those?" she asked. "My sergeant," he said. "She cares about honest clocks. She likes hours that are words." "I like that too," Emma said, and lifted the page so the light could lay on it. "We are setting a soft perimeter tomorrow," Murphy continued, still on the mat with his hat in his hands. "Cones, not barricades. Officers who understand the difference between a parade and a prayer. We will keep emergency lanes clear. We will keep neighbors informed. We will keep kittens asleep if physics allows." Emma glanced at Rose, then back. "Thank you for kittens," she said. "Mrs. Patterson is worried. She likes roses and quiet. She does not like engines in groups." "I already spoke with her," he said. "She told me about aphids and how soap helps if used kindly. We discussed cadence. I promised a walking beat, not a drumline." He slid a folded notice from his coat pocket, a block-printed letter for residents. It had no exclamation marks. It sounded like a neighbor who borrows sugar and returns the cup clean. Rose set the notice by the phone with the map sleeve and the challenge coin. "When men bring paper," she said, "I hang it where I can see whether they keep it." He nodded, the kind of nod that learns before it answers. "I know our uniforms speak before our mouths can fix them," he said. I would like tomorrow to say something better than usual. From the corner of the room, Marcus stirred and opened his eyes. He took in the officer on the mat, the low hat in his hands, the way the house had drawn a line and asked law to stand at it. He did not speak. He did not need to. There are rules, Murphy said, turning a small clipboard. They matter. We wrote them with help. He lifted his gaze to Emma, not over her. Slow in. Slower out. No revving near children. Hands visible around uniform. Road captains speak. Others listen. No patches across your step unless invited. Those are our rules. Emma said. Then they are mine too, he replied. A familiar face blurred on the porch glass. Mrs. Patterson hovered at the edge of courage, scarf tied under her chin, breath silvering the pane. Emma cracked the door and waved her to the warm. Come to the mat, she said. We are speaking about tomorrow. I do not want to interrupt official matters. Mrs. Patterson began, but kitchen heat softened the edge in her voice. She looked from the officer to the low table, to the cracked helmet covered by pale cloth, to the blue mug, to the small hand resting on the quilt. Her mouth thinned, then eased. I have lived on this street a long time, she said to both of them and to the house. We like what we like. Peonies, mail on time, neighbors who shovel straight. We are not a circus street. We are not bringing a circus, Murphy said. We are bringing gratitude with discipline. It must look like both, or it is neither. And noise, she said. A walking beat, he answered. Roses prefer a tempo that keeps sap steady. She blinked and let out a small laugh she had not planned to spend. Who told you that? She asked. You did, he said. 10 minutes ago. I was listening. She considered him anew, then looked to Emma. You pulled a very large man with a very small tool, she said. That is a street I understand. She turned back to Murphy. Will your people step on my primroses? If they do, he said, they will apologize with their mouths and with their hands. They will help you reset stones in spring. Emma lifted the notice and pointed to the blank margin. Can we write Mrs. Patterson and the word flowers here? She asked, so people read and remember who has roses. Yes, he said, and handed her a pen with a blue cap. Emma wrote carefully, letters even, the name and the word flowers. She dotted the I without flourish. Clarity over flourish. The second figure on the porch tapped once with a knuckle. A polite sound. Murphy glanced, then raised a hand in a small go-ahead. My partner will lay cones after sundown, he said. No sirens, no horns. Cones are not war. They are polite suggestions for wheels. Emma liked that cones could be polite if people decided they were. Murphy looked to the square on his chest and pressed again. A soft chirp answered. I am muting to the end of your mat, he said. I will unmute outside. The policy is the policy, but I think silence can be proof too. Then let the picture show you not crossing the line, Rose said. Let it show you holding your hat when you could wear it. He smiled with his eyes more than his mouth. He glanced at the helmet, then lifted a thin envelope from behind his clipboard and held it toward Marcus without stepping past the mat. Accident acknowledgement, he said. Photographs attached. Weather and time written as words. If insurance asks a bad question, show them the sentence where the road says, ice. Marcus raised his hand from the quilt and took the envelope. He did not open it. He slid it under the chamois. Thank you, he said, voice steady. One more, Murphy added, and offered a small card with a number and a name. If a badge forgets our rules tomorrow, call this, it rings my pocket. If it is busy, press the number twice. It still rings my pocket. Mrs. Patterson drew herself up, and if a neighbor forgets herself and scolds a person for standing too near the hydrangea, invite her to my cones, he said. She may supervise. She tried not to smile and failed. I will do that, she said. I will supervise your cones with vigor. Emma laughed, and the sound ran along the boards without stirring anything. It did not mean to. She slid the card into the dish with the coin and turned the coin so the motto faced up, "Family looks after family." The words seemed to nod at the card without arguing about uniforms. Murphy settled his hat onto his head, then paused and lifted it off again, as if remembering the room he was in. He stepped backward off the mat. "Thank you for the quiet," he said. "We will bring what we must. We will bring it kindly. We prefer respect to surprise," Rose said. "And because truth grows stronger when repeated," she added, "bring roses, not sirens." He tipped the brim and moved through the door. Outside, the cold took his breath, like clear water takes a hand. Without malice, he pressed the square on his chest, and the chirp answered. The cruiser rolled away without show. His partner began setting cones in a curve that looked like a suggestion, not a command. Mrs. Patterson remained on the mat one heartbeat longer. She looked at Emma's boots with their laces tucked inside like a secret. She looked at Marcus, then at the small photograph he held without showing. "I will bake," she said abruptly, not as a gesture, as a job. "People behave near good pastry." "Scones," Rose said, "your lemon ones with the sugar on top. We will put a plate on the porch rail and a sign," Emma added. She went to the pad by the phone and wrote in plain letters, "Please keep a walking beat. Thank you for quiet." She drew a small rose in the corner, a spiral that intended to become a flower when time allowed. Mrs. Patterson read it, gave a brisk nod, and tucked the notice under her arm. "I will supervise cones and sugar and beets," she said, and left with dignity that felt like possibility. The house took back its warmth. The mat remembered ordinary feet. Emma set the officer's packet by the log page, and the map, and the coin. She angled the memorandum so the names and written hours could sit where the lamp made them look important. She hovered her palm over the blue stamps the way she shields a candle from a draft. She liked that Tomorrow had written a letter to the street and asked permission rather than forgiveness. Marcus exhaled and let his head rest deeper into the pillow. He nudged the envelope a thumb's width farther beneath the chamois and closed his eyes. "Law that speaks softly," he said, almost to himself. "That is a day I would like to remember." Emma moved the blue mug a little closer and checked the heat with a fingertip. Warm enough to be ready. She pressed her hand over the quilt where the bottle hid. "When you sleep, we will be here," she said under her breath, "because promises prefer the air." From the kitchen came the true beat of preparation, bowls set down. A drawer opened and closed. The quiet rasp of the zip on the plastic sleeve as Rose checked it once more. Outside, cones lined the corner like small orange flowers. Street lights clicked on and made the first ring of evening. Somewhere a cat bell sounded, and then fell still. Kittens would sleep. That was a rule now. Emma looked at the dish where coin and card shared a small circle, metal and paper, promise and path. She felt the outward stretch in her chest, the one like wings practicing. Tomorrow would be large. Large can be kind if you tell it how. She smoothed the sign and set it on the rail to dry. She placed the notice for neighbors against the glass where the first undecided eyes would land. Then she returned to the rug, set her palm above the pencil time on the log, and kept that old morning alive while evening arrived. Outside, the cones glowed like shy lanterns. Inside, the word that had threaded the house all day remained visible without being pointed at properly. And for the first time, the street felt ready to match it. Dawn slid in as a pale band that made the snow look like paper waiting for ink. Heat rose through the old pipes in soft breaths. The clock walked the morning forward. Emma woke before it finished a single quiet circuit and listened to the house breathe. The blue mug stood ready on the low table. The pale chamois rested over the cracked helmet like a calm hand. Marcus slept with his palm cupped over the small photograph, his face turned toward the window, as if he wanted the first light to find him. She eased to the rug without shaking the quilt, and pressed her palm where the warm bottle hid. Heat still lived there. She whispered the promise that had become law inside these rooms. When you sleep, we will be here. I will not let the cold in. Then she crossed to the window and lifted the curtain with one finger. Cones lined the corner like small orange flowers that had chosen to bloom in frost. The notice for neighbors faced the glass. The handwriting looked steady in the pale light. Please keep a walking beat. Thank you for quiet. A covered plate waited on the porch rail. Sugar dusted the towel. Lemon scent slid through the doorframe like a polite guest. Rose entered with her hair pinned higher than usual. The way she wore it for church mornings or official errands, she tied on an apron that had known many kitchens and placed another towel on the radiator to warm. We will need more cups, she said, and a place for card and coin, where hands will not mistake them for decoration. Emma set the small dish on the corner shelf beneath the phone, turned the coin so the motto looked up, and placed the emergency card beside it, so the number could meet any doubtful eyes. Family looks after family. The words made her stand a little taller, as if a brace had been fastened behind her ribs. A thin sound brushed the window. Not a roar, not yet. More like the rumor of one. It slipped into the room and did not disturb anything. It did not mean to. Emma looked at Rose. Rose counted with the kettle, waited for the count to end, then tilted her head and listened. Weather, she said, and the word meant the sound would come whether anyone wished it or not and could still arrive kindly. Captain Murphy came on foot with his hat in his hands. He stepped onto the mat and stopped without being told. Good morning, he said. Cones are set. Officers briefed with the words we agreed. He touched the small square on his chest. A quick bird-like chirp answered. Camera on. He did not touch it again. Mrs. Patterson followed 2 paces behind, carrying a tin that held the weight of scones. A pencil rode behind one ear like a foreman. I will place pastry at operations, she declared, and went to the porch rail to deploy Sugar, as if it were part of traffic control. At the corner, his partner lifted a hand in greeting without making ceremony of it. The rumor thickened. At first it felt like a far train, then like tide, then like heavy bees gathering on a new bloom. Emma felt the floorboards notice. The little bones in her ears arranged themselves. She opened the door a hand width to let the day bring its voice inside on purpose. Cold pressed a clean palm to her cheek and stepped back to the line. The first 2 motorcycles turned at the end of the block as if a string had drawn them. Their engines settled into a steady count. Road captains by the way they moved. Their eyes took in cones and porches and curb. One lifted 2 fingers from the clutch, a small signal that read like a yes in their language. The other tipped his chin toward the porch. Not a nod exactly, more a show of seeing. Behind them, a small column followed with the spacing of people who trust distance and timing. Helmets came off only after engines went quiet. Gloves slid into belts. Hands stayed visible. No one stepped on snow he had not been invited to step on. 2 riders walked to Mrs. Patterson and asked if they might borrow her shovel to move a ridge that would flood the storm drain later in the day. They said, please. She granted the shovel with dignity, as if forgiveness were given in measured portions. Emma stood on the top step with Rose to her side, and the sign tucked against the newel. Keep a walking beat. Thank you for quiet. The sentence did not push. It simply stood where eyes would find it, and did its work the way a proper tool does, when set where hands expect it. Tommy arrived with the next wave, helmet beneath his arm, breath standing in pale puffs. Bear came 2 bikes behind, beard lightly rimed, eyes bright the way a person looks when he has found the right shore. They halted where the first pair had marked the line and let engines drop to a hum that felt orderly rather than proud. Tommy raised his hand with fingers spread, then closed them one by one. The motion fell down the street in a neat echo, an old signal that asked engines to think like feet, slow in, slower out. The block obeyed without persuasion. Cones stood where they had been set. Kittens would sleep. Emma liked how the hand language matched the pencil map on the shelf. Small notes that kept a wide river inside its banks. Bear tapped 2 fingers to the handle of the old shovel leaning by the door. A quick hello to the tool that had worked beyond its size. Then he turned to the crowd and flattened his palm low. Lower, the gesture said. Sound stepped down a notch like a choir remembering where it was. Captain Murphy watched from the corner with his hat still in his hands. He did not speak. He did not need to. When 2 officers drifted forward out of habit, he touched an elbow and pointed at his own shoes as if to say, "Stand where your souls know the rule." They did. He pressed the square on his chest once. The small chirp marked the proof that would not brag. Doors opened along the block. Some neighbors came out ready to disapprove on principle and found their mouths quiet instead. Some arrived with children who sagged in boots and stared at chrome like a river they had not known could run through this town. No one shouted. No one used a name that was not his to use. A man, 3 houses down, set a folding chair for his mother, with its legs square to the curb. The sound built in layers rather than spikes. Groups arrived, settled, hushed themselves as if a conductor had breathed a request. Road captains drew lanes with fingers and chins and shoulders. Invisible paths became visible courtesy. There was room for an ambulance if need asked. There was room for a bicycle to slip through and wave as if this were a parade that had practiced being a neighbor. Tommy climbed onto a trailer, 2 doors down, and spoke without a microphone. He did not raise his voice. The block did the lifting by choosing silence. Family looks after family, he said, and the sentence moved soft over leather and wool. We are guests. We behave. We thank with our bodies, not our noise. If you do not understand, turn around and go home. No one turned. He nodded once, accepting the answer. Bear held up a laminated card. The house rules printed in classroom letters. Slow in, slower out. No revving near children. Hans visible near uniforms. Road captains speak. Others listen. No patches across this step unless invited. He pointed at each line with a blunt finger, then pointed at the house. He did not wave the card. He posted it in gentle air and let it hang for the length of a breath. Emma saw words she had spoken, living on a card in a large hand, and felt her ribs ease. Marcus woke into that quiet and listened. He did not fight the sound. He let it pass through like weather and noticed how it left space behind. He watched the porch and saw Emma planted at the newel like a small mare with a soft ordnance. He smiled, without showing teeth, and tightened his fingers around the photograph. Rose tucked the warmed towel over his shoulder and set the blue mug into his hand. He drank, and the room breathed with him. The waves kept arriving. The block filled. Then the next, the walking beat held. Officers shifted 2 cars to a side street, with a map and a grin that asked for help and earned it. Mrs. Patterson ruled her scones with a pencil and a look that could bend iron. Quarters for small hands, halves for large. 2. For the man who cleared the ridge at her mailbox. She told a young rider to use the path and not the lawn. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and flowed around like water, learning a wiser route. At the far end, 2 riders shut their engines and walked their bikes in. The gesture traveled backward like a bow drawn along a long string, hands lifted and settled, heads tipped toward porches. The word properly seemed to hang between strangers and make sense even to those who had not spoken it yet. A small child stepped off a porch and reached for a bright pipe that still held heat. An officer saw and moved, not fast enough to frighten, fast enough to help. He knelt and spoke a soft sentence Emma could not hear, held his hand near the pipe, hissed a little theater hiss, then opened his palm to reveal a paper snowflake, and placed it on the mitten as a badge of wisdom. The mother mouthed, "Thank you." He tipped 2 fingers toward his hat without wearing it. Captain Murphy watched and let the picture keep the proof. Tommy looked to Bear. Bear looked to the house. He hooked his thumb at himself and lifted an eyebrow. A question asked without noise. Emma glanced at Rose. Rose made the smallest nod. "Carry on." Tommy stepped to the bottom step and did not climb. He stood 1 riser lower and spoke up instead of down. "Ready for visitors, little mayor?" he asked. Emma looked at the street, at Marcus with the mug and the towel, at Rose with her hand near the phone and the packet and the coin. She nodded once. "Keep a walking beat," she said. He turned and made the sign. Hands went up and down. Engines answered like voices lowering into a hymn. The first riders came one by one. They did not crowd. They did not ask to touch. They set small objects at the porch rail, as if placing stones on a marker. A patch with wings sewn by a careful hand, a key fob dark with miles, a tiny wrench that looked more charm than tool. No money, no envelopes, only things that had traveled and meant work. Emma touched each with 1 finger, a small tap that said receive. "Thank you," she said, and no one asked for more words than that. The sound swelled and ebbed like tide, obeying a moon none of them could see, and all of them believed in. The street that had never hosted anything larger than a moving van now carried a river, and did not spill. The discipline inside the noise felt like a braid of quiet. Emma liked it. She liked that the map had become ground, that notes like fuel and shoulder and friendly had turned into hands and lanes and faces that matched those words. Bear wrote a line on his clipboard with a pencil sharpened without vanity, and underlined the time once. Marcus set the mug down and laid his fingers on the chamois, as if to thank the soft thing for drawing a line between hurt and pride. He looked at Emma. She tipped her chin like a salute. His laugh came easier. Sun slid along the block and sharpened edges, and then softened them under a small cloud. The sign dried to a deep, steady black. People read it and behaved as if the sentence trusted them to behave. Emma stood a little straighter. The wings, feeling in her chest, spread, and then folded neatly, ready to work again. Down the street, the hum lifted a step and then settled. Road captains conferred with glances. Tommy breathed a quiet satisfaction and looked to the porch. "Ready for more?" he asked. Emma did not need to be loud. The house, the cones, the scones, the camera, the coin, the card, the chamois, the map, and the people all seemed to lean in to help carry her word. "Properly," she said. It passed down the line like a candle lighting another without losing anything. The street understood, and the morning, which had begun as paper waiting for ink, finally took its first bold stroke. By late morning the light had the clean shine of new ice, a cool glaze that made edges honest. Breath hung in white commas and drifted away. The walking beat held, hands spoke, and engines listened. Emma stood on the top step, with the little sign tucked to the newel, and felt the house breathing behind her, warm and sure. In the dish by the phone, the coin and the plain card sat like 2 quiet suns, metal and paper sharing the same steady light. A small pocket of space opened at the curb, not a stage, only a place for eyes to rest. sound folded lower, as if someone had laid a soft cloth over the morning. Rose touched Emma's shoulder, the weight brief and blessing light, then moved back to tend cups and towels and the quiet discipline of sugar. Tommy lifted his hand, and the hum eased further. Bear stepped forward with a dark garment bag cradled in his arms. The bag carried a clear window and a small numbered seal pressed flat. Along the seal's edge, someone had written initials, and the hour spelled out in full words. Chain of custody sat there in neat ink. Emma liked that an important thing could prove it had been carried kindly. Captain Murphy stood at the corner with his hat in his hands. He tapped the small square on his chest once and let the picture keep working. His partner nudged 2 cones by an inch, not to control, only to help. Mrs. Patterson planted herself at the porch rail with scones and a pencil like a baton, quarters for small hands and halves for large, the tin lid leaning against the post like a cymbal waiting its note. A man with a camera approached from the far end. Not rushing, not sneaking, he raised a hand to ask, rather than to take. He waited at the cones until Murphy nodded him through, then waited again at the step until Rose tipped her chin. He aimed first at the sign, then at the dish with coin and card, then at the towel warming on the radiator through the open door. The camera answered with modest clicks. A sound like stamps meeting paper. Tommy spoke no louder than needed. Family looks after family, he said. We said we would thank her properly. He looked to Emma and left the rest unsaid. Properly was large enough. Bear slid a thumb beneath the seal and broke it with a soft pop that everyone could hear. He drew the zipper down, the little teeth whispering. The garment bag opened like a curtain. Inside hung a small black leather jacket made by hands that respected miles. Straight stitches marched along the seams, across the back. Wings and a skull were worked in thread that would never scratch, and the words Honorary Angel arced in warm gold. On the front, 3 modest patches read Emma and Millbrook and Lifesaver. Letters proud, without shouting. The breath in Emma's chest did the wing thing again, that outward stretch that made room for both wonder and steadiness. She looked to Rose. Rose's nod said, take the gift and let it be what it is. Emma stepped down 1 tread so her eyes could meet Bear's. May I? He asked, palms open. You may, she said. He held the jacket at the shoulders with the care used for newborns and old books. Tommy crouched and guided 1 sleeve with the calm of a road captain steering through weather. Emma slid 1 arm in, then the other. The leather settled with a weight that felt like truth, neither heavy nor light, simply exact. Warmth rose through the lining and met her own. Clean hide, cotton thread, the faintest ghost of oil, all of it like a promise that machines will start when asked. The crowd did not cheer. It breathed in and breathed out. A single creature, finding quiet joy. Gloves tapped palms. Heads tipped. Mrs. Patterson dabbed the corner of 1 eye and then pretended she had been hunting a crumb. Bear lifted the house rules card on his clipboard and tapped the line that said, no patches across this step unless invited. He touched the word unless with 1 blunt finger, then touched the new patch on Emma's shoulder, a line drawn without sound, seen and received. Emma set her fingertip to the edge of the patch and felt the tiny ridges like a map. She did not speak. The jacket spoke enough. Tommy glanced to the doorway. Marcus had pushed himself half upright against the pillows, the blue mug near his knee, the pale chamois laid across the broken helmet like mercy. Rose stood beside him the way a tree stands, steady because it is its nature. Marcus's eyes were clear and wet at the rim, the look of someone newly permitted to feel. There is 1 more piece, Tommy said, and lifted a slim folder with an embossed seal the color of pewter. He opened it to the street. The paper had real weight. An emblem pressed into the fiber sat at the top without ink, only pressure. Below, Plain words named a certificate of honorary membership. The date lived as full words. Winter spelled out. The day written long. At the bottom, names and road names and titles signed in real hand, each followed by the hour written in words inside small boxes. A chain of names, a chain of hours, a promise with witnesses. Emma placed a finger under one line the way she did when reading with care. She found Tommy and Bear. She saw a space where Marcus had not signed and understood that some signatures are given in other currency. She liked that the page honored time in ink. She liked that time was treated as a thing people could keep honest. Tommy turned the folder toward the camera and toward the square on Murphy's chest, then closed it and handed it to Rose. "For the wall," he said, and everyone heard it. The cameraman raised his hand once more. Rose nodded. He took the picture of the small jacket on the small shoulders, the emblem on the paper, the hand on the patch, the coin in its dish. Clicks, stacked like soft stamps. Evidence gathered itself without fuss. Then Marcus cleared his throat. The sound reached as far as it needed, and no farther. He slid the chamois aside and set the cracked helmet on the floor as if to tell it rest. "Your work is known." He swung his legs over the bed and stood with care, Rose's palm at his elbow. He took slow steps to the doorway and stood inside the frame, not past it. House and street met at that line and agreed. Emma turned. The jacket made a small creak as leather learned her shape. "I have something for you," he said, the voice rough in the best way, the way stones in a river become smooth. He drew a small velvet box from his pocket, its corners polished by years. He opened it with a tenderness that did not match his size. Inside lay a ring, silver worn soft by touch, the face plain and honest, the kind of metal that does not explain, it just endures. "This belonged to my daughter," he said. He did not say the name. He did not need to. The photograph under his palm the night before had already taught Emma the name without sound. "I gave it to her when she turned the age you are now. It meant I will love you, I will protect you, and I will remember even when it hurts." He looked at the ring, then at Emma, then at Rose, then at the street. He made sure every witness was a witness. He pressed his thumb to the band, warming it, asking it to carry one more story. Then he knelt. His left leg shook, honest about pain, but it held. Rose slid her hand down his arm and steadied him without stealing any part of the act. Emma pulled off her glove. Her hand was small and clean and serious. Marcus took it in both of his, big and careful, and slid the ring home. It was a touch loose, not enough to worry, enough to prove there was room to grow. "I will take care of it," she said. "I will remember her." She did not speak the name. She did not have to. The ring held it. The crowd did not clap. It exhaled and stayed still, as if a bird had landed and no one wanted to scare it. A glove brushed a cheek. A jaw leaned into a knuckle. Captain Murphy looked down once, then up, and touched the square on his chest so the picture could keep the quiet. Marcus stayed on his knee one breath longer, as if bowing to a grave and a cradle at once. He rose with Rose's help and stepped back to the threshold. His eyes met Emma's, and found not pity, but a faithful mirror. "Jacket suits you," he said. "It is warm," she answered, "and it feels like work." He let a laugh out from the middle of his chest. "That is exactly right," he said. Tommy cleared his throat without fanfare. He lifted the leather folder again and then offered a pen to the first road captain at the trailer. One by one, under open winter, hands signed the ledger page he had placed there, each name followed by the hour written in words. The camera clicked at the first and at the last and at two in the middle. Mrs. Patterson watched the line with her pencil, like a teacher taking attendance, and fed the signatures with lemon and sugar. Bear set a small book on the porch rail, bound in leather dark as coffee, its edges rubbed by miles. He opened to a blank page and turned it so Emma could see. Names and towns and numbers filled earlier leaves in neat hand, the useful kind, the rescue kind. In the margin, someone had written a line that looked enough like a rule to count. If ever in need, call and say Emma, and the road will answer. Emma traced the space beside that sentence without touching ink. She liked that help could be organized as carefully as traffic. She liked that the book looked used already, as if stories had been waiting for it. Captain Murphy stepped one pace forward onto gravel, hat still in his hands. He lifted the notice for neighbors so the camera could see the signature at the bottom and the hour in words. He set it back on the rail beside the book. Law and road, paper and hide, both kinds of promise within reach. The cameraman waited for one last image and asked with his eyes. Rose nodded. He took the picture that would live longer than any plan. A small girl in a black jacket with a gold word on the back, a ring catching winter light on a small hand, a biker who had knelt a breath ago, an officer without his hat on, a neighbor holding a pencil like a scepter, road captains standing still as rafters, holding silence like a duty. The shutter sounded like a soft stamp that said not ended, simply recorded. Engines woke a shade, remembering they were machines. Tommy rolled his fingers for the walking beat. The rhythm returned, not louder, only wider. Bear checked his clipboard and wrote the hour in words. Marcus sat and placed his palm over the photograph again. The ring now a small, bright circle inside the larger circle of house and street and promise made before witnesses. Emma looked at the sign. The ink had dried deep and dark. She looked at her sleeve, the crease already learning her elbow. She looked at the ring, then at the faces that had come to show a child that kindness could scale without losing its shape. She raised her chin a little and felt the wings open and fold in neat order, working as designed. "Thank you," she said. She did not aim the words at one person. She let them fall like light over the gathering and sink where they wished. The street answered not with noise, but with that same good breath, the new language they had learned together. Tommy pointed down the block, then touched his temple, then his heart. Route, attention, care. The column began to turn with patience. Hands signed. Engines answered. The walking beat held. Cones stayed where cones like to be. Mrs. Patterson set the lid on the tin with a click that sounded like an official seal. Captain Murphy placed his hat back on his head without pulling it tight, as if leaving room for quiet to keep living. On the rail, the leather folder lay beside coin and card and book, paper and metal and hide and ink, all with proper weight. Evidence did not need to shout when a whole street had watched the truth happen. Emma stood in the doorway between warm and cold and felt both sides agree. Properly, she said to herself, and this time the word felt less like instruction and more like the right name for what they had made together. By mid-afternoon, the air had settled into a peace that felt earned. The light turned gold and low, sweeping along the porches like a last inspection before dusk. The street was no longer crowded, yet it held the memory of what had moved through it. Tire tracks were faint shadows, curving like soft handwriting on clean paper. The smell of fuel had faded into something gentler, metal and wind and bread cooling on kitchen counters. Emma stood at the top step in her black jacket. The patch caught light in small pulses, gold bending to bronze as clouds crossed. She could still feel the rhythm of engines somewhere inside her ribs, a beat steady and sure. She rested her hand on the porch rail and tapped her thumb once, twice, 3 times, testing. The sound was quiet, but the beat was still there. The walking beat held. Marcus sat near the window, mug balanced on his knee. The cracked helmet rested on the rug under its chamois. a relic that no longer demanded attention. He had learned to let it rest. His eyes followed the last thin line of steam leaving his drink. His chest did not ache the way it used to. The pain had turned into something smaller, honest, and almost kind. Captain Murphy's cruiser idled at the corner with its lights off. The hat on the dash looked tired but content. His partner stacked cones in the trunk, 2 at a time, as if each were a paragraph, ending a long and careful report. Mrs. Patterson leaned over her gate, pencil tucked behind her ear, and watched the last of the cleanup. She had promised to bake more scones for the weekend. The promise itself felt like an official document, witnessed by everyone still within earshot. The young rider who had over-revved earlier lingered at the far end of the street. He had stayed behind to help with the sweeping. His gloves were black with dust. When he finally turned to leave, he lifted a hand toward Emma. A gesture of apology and allegiance folded together, she returned the wave with the brief gravity of someone who understood both. Rose came out with a dish towel and brushed a few crumbs from the porch rail. She checked the sky and then looked down at her daughter. "You'll need to hang that jacket up before supper," she said. "Leather keeps better when it rests." "I know," Emma said, and smiled faintly. "I just like how it sounds when I move." She flexed her shoulders. The leather creaked softly, like a whisper of memory, refusing to fade. Inside the house, the phone sat beside the dish with the coin and the card. The coin's engraving caught a narrow beam of light. "Family looks after family." The card beneath it bore the captain's signature and the time written in words. Next to them lay the ledger book, its pages rippling slightly from the warm air rising off the radiator. In the corner of the open page, the paper snowflake Emma had pressed there earlier was still holding dated EREDI2M. The ink around it had not bled. Proof and tenderness could live on the same sheet. Tommy's voice echoed faintly from down the road as the last group rolled away. "If you need us again, you know the word to say." Emma touched the margin of the book where his sentence waited beneath the snowflake and nodded. She did not need to speak it aloud. Some words were meant to rest until called for. A sparrow landed on the porch rail near the book. It tilted its head toward the pages, chirped once, and flew off again, leaving behind a single feather so small it looked drawn. Rose picked it up and placed it inside the ledger, closing the cover gently. "For next time," she said. Marcus shifted his weight and stood. His leg trembled for a moment, but it held. He walked to the door and leaned on the frame. "To engines that behaved," he said quietly, raising his mug, "to neighbors who stayed, to a ring that remembers without stabbing, to a jacket that fits the work." Emma laughed, the sound bright and shy at once. "To people who keep the beat," she answered. She held up her hand with the ring and let the light catch it. Marcus nodded, the gesture slow and deliberate. "That too," he said. He looked out across the quiet street, where children were starting to reclaim the sidewalk with chalk and scooters. The world had resumed, but differently, cleaner, maybe, or simply more awake. Captain Murphy and his partner finished their sweep, tipped their hats toward the porch, and climbed into the cruiser. The engine turned over once and held a low hum, a respectful echo of the morning's thunder. No sirens, no rush, just a departure done properly. The cruiser rolled away, its tires leaving barely a whisper. Mrs. Patterson lingered a moment longer, then crossed the street with a small tin in her hands. "For the keepsakes," she said, setting it on the porch rail. The tin was old, the kind that used to hold sewing needles. Its surface shone from years of being handled. She patted the lid twice, then turned for home. "Properly," she added, almost to herself. Rose watched her go and smiled. "I think that word's going to stay around here for a while," she said. Emma nodded. "It should," she said. "It's a good word." She touched the ring again. "It fits everything." From somewhere down the block, a faint mechanical rhythm returned, the sound of a broom being dragged against pavement by one of the stragglers. The sound was slow, steady, and entirely right. Emma listened until it faded, then reached up to take off her jacket. The lining still held the day's warmth. She folded it over her arm like a flag at rest. "Tea?" Rose asked. "Tea," Emma said. Marcus followed them inside, setting his mug on the counter. The table looked different now. The dishes were the same, the kettle the same, but there was a gravity to the air, a sense that something had been set right, not by noise or punishment, but by care executed to its end. Rose poured water into 3 cups. The steam curled around the ceiling and met the faint smell of oil and leather that still lingered in the room. Marcus watched it drift and thought of smoke, but this time the memory didn't hurt. Emma placed the jacket over the chair nearest the window. The patch glowed softly in the sunlight, like an ember waiting to be stirred. She brushed a speck of dust from it and whispered, "We did it properly." The words were small, but they filled the room. Outside, the street exhaled. Cones were gone. Tracks had faded. Yet the memory of the rhythm, hands, breath, the deliberate hum of order remained, somewhere beyond the horizon. Engines were stretching into distance, carrying the story forward. Marcus looked once more at the photo on the wall, the one of Sarah holding her helmet and smiling like she knew roads obeyed her. He set his hand over his heart and then over the ring on Emma's finger. "Family looks after family," he said again, quieter this time. Emma looked up. "Always," she said. The kettle clicked as it cooled. The window pane trembled slightly in the last wind of the day. Later, when the house had grown dim and the lamps came on, Emma opened the ledger book once more. She looked at the snowflake and the faint indentation of her name on the page. Beneath it, she added one line in small, careful letters. "We kept the beat." She dated it not with numbers, but with words, the same way they had taught her. Winter, the day the street stood still. She closed the book and set it by the coin and the card. The feather inside made a soft whisper as the pages met. She turned off the light, paused at the doorway, and looked back at the shapes of the things left on the table. Paper, metal, hide, and ink, all steady in their places. Proof did not need to shout when everyone who mattered already knew. Outside, the night was quiet, but if you listened closely, the rhythm still existed. Subtle, human, and whole. It moved in the distance, underfoot and overhead, in breath and heartbeats, and the sound of snow settling. The walking beat held. Spring arrived like a careful apology. First in the soft throat of gutters waking, then in the smell of damp wood that had waited a season to breathe. The block looked ordinary again, and ordinary felt newly precious. Lawns remembered their lines, mailboxes remembered their names, but on the Richardson porch, a small triangle kept quietly shining, the coin and the plain card in their dish, the leather book with its gentle corners, the certificate on the wall, where an embossed seal pressed its calm weight into paper. 3 months had passed since engines learned to walk. The jacket had found new creases that already told stories. The ring had learned Emma's hand and sat there as if it had always known the way. The little sign she lettered rested on the newel inside a frame, not hung but ready, like a banner that could return to duty without being taught the words again. On a Saturday that smelled of wet leaves and soap, Rose wiped the kitchen table with a hot cloth and set the ledger down like a loaf cooling after work well done. The latest page held steady ink and a blue bank stamp on a deposit stub. Scholarship Fund. The memo read in the neat hand of a teller who liked to do something good before lunch. The sum did not sit like a boast. It sat like a plan. Beside it, paper clips held a sheaf of small receipts that had traveled through the mail in careful envelopes, some printed, some written by hand. all signed by names that ended in road or highway more often than street. Proof did not need to shout when it arrived so well-mannered. Emma came in from the porch with trace mud on her shoes and a pencil behind her ear. She shook her sleeves until the leather lay straight and slid into the chair that had learned her weight. The jacket creaked, a friendly hinge. She opened the ledger and reread the line beneath the stamp. Then she turned the page back to where the paper snowflake still held the corner, as if winter had left a small white thumb on the story. "Before we go," Rose said, "bring the article. People like the picture first and the words second." Emma returned with the frame wrapped in a towel. The headline kept its proud and plain balance. David's photograph kept doing its steady work. A small girl in a black jacket stood with a word in gold across her back. A ring caught winter light on a hand that had not shaken. A biker had been kneeling a breath before. An officer held his hat off. A neighbor lifted a pencil like a scepter. Road captains stood as still as rafters. The shutter had stamped that afternoon into time. The frame let it keep stamping. "School first," Rose said. "Then the bank. Then Mrs. Patterson for tea and opinion." They walked the 3 blocks with the framed article tucked against Emma's ribs, the ledger in Rose's tote, and the dish left at home like a pair of elders who preferred to greet in their chosen chair. The air tasted of old snow, telling the truth at last. Children chalked hopscotch in front of the post office. Captain Murphy came along the sidewalk with his hat in his hand, nodded to Rose, tipped 2 fingers to Emma, and kept his pace with the patience of a man who knew why streets worked when they did. In the classroom, the air smelled of pencil shavings and wax. Mrs. Collins had made a small square of space at the front, a place where a visiting story could stand. On the whiteboard she had written a sentence that looked like both fence and welcome. "Do not judge by the patch until you have met the hand." Emma showed, rather than told. She set the framed photograph on the ledge. She laid the certificate beside it so the seal could catch the thin light. She opened the ledger so the snowflake faced the room. Then she stood with her hands behind her back the way Rose did, when thinking and spoke only what was needed. A moment fell. A girl helped. A house warmed him. Friends came. Law walked soft. A promise got written down. "Did the engines make you afraid?" a classmate asked. "They made me listen," Emma said. "We asked them to be quiet so we could hear better." "Do you wear the jacket to sleep?" another child asked. "Only the feeling of it," she said, and gentle laughter moved across the desks like sunlight. A boy near the back lifted his hand halfway and let it hover. "My brother rides," he said. "He forgets to keep his hands quiet." He put his palm flat on the desk and studied his fingers like a new alphabet. "Sometimes you forget, and then you remember," Emma said. "We had signs. We kept making them with our hands until the day learned them." Mrs. Collins asked for the ledger. Rose held it steady, while small faces leaned in. She did not let fingers touch, but she let eyes come close enough to smell leather and ink. "This is a book of need and answers," Rose said. "The rule inside is plain. If ever in need, call and say Emma, and the road will answer." "What if the road cannot hear?" a child asked. "Then we walk," Rose said, "and we make a lane for each other." At the bank, the glass door chimed a greeting. The teller with hair, the color of strong tea, recognized the ledger and returned a stamped envelope with the name spelled right and the address clear. She had written the hour beneath the stamp in words, a thin ribbon of proof. Outside, a van from the paper eased to the curb. David leaned out, not with a lens but with a hand. "I brought prints," he said. "Houses choose which moments they keep." He passed a flat brown package. "Stories sit better when you let them breathe." He lifted 2 fingers like a road sign and rolled on. Back home, they opened the package with a butter knife. Heavy stock photographs slid onto the table. each one landing with the soft sound of proof arriving. Emma paused at one that looked like an ordinary thing, pretending to be quiet, or perhaps the other way around. The street after the last wave had turned the corner, cone stacks near the cruiser, broom lines across the curb, the sign steady on the newel, the coin and card a dim gleam behind the window, the book closed and patient, a photograph of what remains, frame that, Rose said, history is not only people in the middle of it, history is the place that remembers how you left it. The phone rang with Marcus's pattern, too short, a breath, then one. Emma answered without names. "How is the leg?" she asked. "Better when the air is kind," he said. "Wrench says the old bike thinks it is young when I polish it with the towel you sent." "I did not send a towel," she said. "You did," he said. "It lives inside a letter and smells like cinnamon." His laugh lived in his chest again without scraping. "We built something, and we are building it in other places. Smaller. Same rules. Slow in, slower out. No revving near children. Say the word properly before you start." "Do people listen?" she asked. "They listen to hands better than to mouths," he said. "We keep showing them." After they hung up, Emma wrote small thank you notes the way Mrs. Collins had taught. She wrote to Wrench and to Bear and to a rider named Razor, who, Tommy had said, had found a way to see his child again after years of paper that liked to say no. She kept the sentences short and let white space do part of the work. "I am glad the road answered. I am keeping the beat. If you need us, call and say Emma." She dated each card in words and drew one small wing in the corner like a check mark that had learned to fly. By mid-afternoon, Mrs. Patterson arrived with a tin for keepsakes and a shallow box for the ledger corner. She transferred things from dish to tin with the care she used for lifting a cake from its pan. "A house needs a way to hold the pieces of a story," she said. "Otherwise you tidy the truth away and cannot find it when someone knocks." They sat in the kind of quiet that follows a day busy in the right way. The kettle whispered. The window rattled once with a playful wind. Captain Murphy passed the house again, tipped his hat toward the kitchen, and went on. Emma thought of how his hat had rested on the dash that winter day, and how his voice had poured law and kindness into the same cup. When tea cooled to the kind side of hot, Rose lifted the ledger and turned to the last page. "One more line," she said. "Then we let the day go to bed." Emma took the pen and wrote slowly, the way you write on purpose. "We kept the beat." She added a second line that felt less like a repeat than like a door left on its latch. "If ever in need, call and say Emma, and we will answer." She dated both lines in words and watched the ink settle like a promise finding its chair. "Properly," Mrs. Patterson said. Rose repeated it. Emma let the word expand to fit the corners, then fold small enough to live in a pocket. The sun crossed the kitchen floor in a last slow reach and withdrew, a hand leaving a table after checking for crumb. Evening stepped through the neighborhood and found people where it had left them, only a little better arranged. Emma carried the jacket to its hook and hung it by the shoulders so the weight would not pull the leather wrong. The patch shone like a small lamp. She touched the ring, then the patch, then the framed photograph of the empty street the triangle held. On the porch, she set the new frame beside the dish. The coin caught the last light and let it go. The card showed its signature, and the hour in words, a quiet echo of a voice that preferred to whisper. The book waited with its feather inside, keeping a place for the next need and the next answer. Down the block, a motorcycle passed. Not a brother she knew, just a neighbor with a machine that liked being awake when other things were going to sleep. The rider throttled down at the corner without being told and lifted 2 fingers toward the porch. Emma lifted 2 back, small and exact. Nothing needed arranging. Hands knew the language now. Rose stepped out with a blanket. "It will be cool after dark," she said. "We will be warm," Emma answered, and it sounded less like a forecast and more like a rule built to survive more than one season. Later, when lamps softened the corners, the house breathed the way it had breathed. The first night, a child made a decision at a door. Marcus called once more to say he had cleaned the helmet and set it high. A thing you had to want in order to reach. He did not say goodbye. He said the other thing, the one that does not close a story so much as leave it able to turn a page. "See you later," he said. Emma smiled so he could hear it. "See you later," she answered, and the words did not fall. They took their place beside the coin and the card and the book and the framed picture of an empty street that remembered everything. In the end, The House Breathed with Them isn't just a story about a girl, a wounded man, or a street that learned to listen. It's about what happens when ordinary people decide to act properly in a world that often forgets how. It reminds us that kindness doesn't need to shout to be powerful, and that respect, when practiced with discipline, is stronger than anger. The story asks us to look at the moments when silence becomes dangerous, when staying quiet means allowing unfairness to grow. It teaches that speaking up doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means opening a door, keeping a promise, or choosing patience over pride. Marcus, Rose, and little Emma each learn that dignity isn't given by status or strength, it's earned by how we treat one another when no one is watching. True gold fears no fire, as the saying goes, and people, too, reveal their worth not when things are easy, but when they choose grace in the middle of chaos. The road, the ring, and the patch all become symbols of something larger, community built not on noise, but on steady hands, second chances, and faith that good order can exist without cruelty. Maybe the real message is simple. The world heals when we do things properly, with care, with fairness, with open eyes. If this story moved you or reminded you of a moment when you found courage and kindness, share it in the comments below. Tell us your story. Hit like if you believe in the quiet strength of doing what's right, and subscribe to hear more stories that speak softly but stay long in the heart. May your days ahead be steady, your nights peaceful, and may every street you walk learn to breathe kindly with you.